This video is brought to you by my patrons. If you want to support, head over to patreon.com/Maggie Mae Fish. And by CuriosityStream. Well, hello there. It's been a minute. You know, I was going to release this video sooner, but I needed to do $30 million worth of reshoots. I'm just kidding. It actually took me so long because later in this video, Jared Leto will be reprising everyone's favorite role he's ever done. Of course, I'm talking about his Mark David Chapman.
You like Japanese food? I've been to Japan. I've been all over the world.
Okay. I wanted to start this video with a very timely tweet from Dad himself, Mr. Snyder. It reads,
Batman is all of us. He is our rage at injustice. He stands alone as we all wish we could in the face of a corrupt system which wishes to oppress and exploit. He is that broken child, searching the dark alleys of the human soul to bring balance to the world. Hashtag Batman Day.
This mental image of a hurting child who lashes out because of inner turmoil and pain is actually the thing that I think Snyder is most successful at in his work, depicting men who are angry and alone, burdened by their emotions, which is what I think a lot of people who enjoy his take on Batman and Superman identify with. I think they feel seen in that pain and isolation. And I think this is reflected in a sentiment that I mentioned in the previous video. This is what superheroes would look like in the real world. I do think part of that supposed realism is pure aesthetic, especially given the dichotomy of Marvel films or DC films. Marvel films obviously playing with a wider range of tones, but overall have a more Saturday morning cartoon feel to them, and DC being the one that took the Dark Knight Rises tone that was so successful for Nolan. But it's obviously much more than aesthetic. When someone says that this is how the real world is, what they mean is, I connect with this film because my world feels like this. I see an emotional truth reflected in these movies. People in the industry are rightfully frustrated by the resources that Snyder burns through, while marginalized creators can often hardly get a meeting. He gets opportunity after opportunity with inflated budgets, even though his films often underperform at the box office and get critically panned. But this well-earned negativity towards Snyder seems to create the feeling of being a lone wolf in his most fanatic fans. And once again, I'm talking about a very specific type of overly enthusiastic, overly defensive fan, who are very different from the many lovely Snyder fans that I've had wonderful interactions with. But let's get to what this video is really about. Men, 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 manly men, a Martha. Men, 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 men. Unfortunately, this will be the last Snyder episode, unless you all give me $70 million for reshoots. I can put it in black and white or whatever. I just want to give a quick content warning. This next section is about sexual assault, so skip to this time code if you'd rather not hear it. I wanted to start off talking about a concerning comment I received on my last Snyder video regarding Sucker Punch. Yes, the scenario at the end of Sucker Punch is absolutely a rape scene, holy shit. There weren't a ton of comments saying that it wasn't, but it was enough and it was all men, so I felt very obligated to reiterate that yes, this is a rape scene. You cannot give consent when you are under duress. Baby Doll is not willingly imprisoned at this institution. She's not willingly in this specific situation within the scene. She's there against her will. She's a prisoner. Nothing about her situation suggests that she can give consent. If you have a gun to your head and the person with the gun orders you to choose between two terrible outcomes, you are not free to choose. Baby Doll says out loud that there is no other way.
There's gotta be another way.
No. Don't take me to McDonald's after they stop serving breakfast and then tell me that I can have whatever I want.
I don't want lunch. I want breakfast.
That's not giving anyone the freedom to choose what they want, especially when we're talking about sexual consent. And this kind of ignores the fact that rape was a reality in mental institutions, so it doesn't really work as a metaphor here. You can't effectively use something as a metaphor for itself. And I know that Snyder likes making his movies dark, both thematically and visually. But if you're going to explore these darker truths about rampant sexual abuse in mental institutions, then ending your story with, it's okay because she's free, in her mind, is at best extremely irresponsible and at worst downright disturbing. Sexual abuse, eugenics, and controlling women's bodies were features of mental institutions, not bugs. Dominating the female body was a priority for these doctors, and lobotomies were seen as a way of fixing a rocky marriage by simply making the woman more docile, especially in the bedroom. Lobotomies were a technology specifically developed to take sexual agency away from women. And this type of violence persists to this day. What also makes this sequence just so weirdly disturbing is the casting of Jon Hamm. In casting this rapist character, who carries himself as if he's the supreme authority in the hierarchy of this institution, they chose one of the most attractive, beloved celebrities in Western media. Because cinema is a visual medium, in mainstream films we're conditioned to read meaning into what each character looks like. Clean-cut man equals hero. Someone who is deformed or conventionally unattractive equals evil. Snyder tends to favor cartoonishly obvious casting that emphasizes each character's physical perfection or imperfections. It is possible to subvert these aesthetic expectations in interesting ways, like Chris Evans' character from Knives Out. Look at that cozy cable knit sweater, who would suspect him? But instead of a subversion, in Sucker Punch we just get a moody sex scene where both parties are characterized as having a good time.
It's the way she looked at me. Like she wanted me to do it.
As a little thought experiment, instead of Jon Hamm, how about we imagine Baby Doll was with Walter Freeman? Because if you got a lobotomy in the mid-20th century, there's a good chance it was done by Walter Freeman. Once you put Freeman's face over Hamm's face, the reason they cast Hamm becomes comically obvious. In casting a sex icon as a lobotomist, the scene is signaling to straight women, see, it's okay, it's happening. I mean, don't you wanna fuck Jon Hamm? And it's saying to straight men, see, it's okay this is happening. Don't you wanna fuck Jon Hamm? I mean, be Jon Hamm? It never problematizes the fact that Jon Hamm is a grade A hunk of American meat. It revels in that aesthetic. And of course, he ends up being the contrived and predictable good guy at the last second. He rejects the corruption that he somehow wasn't aware of, even though everyone who works at this institution is an absolute creep show. As soon as Baby Doll is lobotomized, the movie switches to Sweet Pea's point of view, practically forgetting about Baby Doll entirely. Snyder does this a lot, where as soon as he cuts away from a female character, she may as well cease to exist. Before her lobotomy, at least she was able to say no and try to fight back. But by the end of the movie, she can't even do that. So in this supposedly feminist, liberating film, the happy ending requires the female protagonist to be reduced to a zombified sex object by a power structure that's explicitly coded as hypermasculine. And this reduction to an object is characterized as if she's doing it willingly, to herself, somehow consenting to it in a ridiculously contrived form of narrative victim blaming.
But you wanted me to do it.
In her last shot, she's been transformed into a being that cannot resist. One who exists for the sexual satisfaction of both the men within the narrative and the assumed hetero male audience. Oh, did I mention that Freeman had no formal surgical training? So yeah, he was allowed to put ice picks in women's heads for years. You can also view Sucker Punch as a kind of psychological metaphor, that the female characters each represent various parts of the main character's personality, as if Snyder is separating the id, ego, and superego into different characters to make a point about one single character's overall mental journey. All under the direction of a male authority figure, of course. Sucker Punch's resolution also pretty explicitly states that if you are imprisoned in an unwinnable situation, all you have to do is retreat into the particular corner of your mind and you'll be free there. In this interpretation, sure, the baby doll part of the mind is sacrificed, but it's so that the sweet pea part can be free. Oh, and that character had to die. Oh, and this one too. With that reading, the movie is telling us that the best response to being abused, imprisoned, tortured, and violated is to mentally lobotomize ourselves, killing off the vast majority of your mind.
Let the past die. Kill it, if you have to.
This idea that a victim of imprisonment, torture, abuse, and violence can simply retreat into or cut off a part of their mind to find a type of freedom is not only harmful to victims, but in a very, very real way, completely incorrect. In 1985, Elaine Scarry published The Body in Pain, an in-depth study of how pain affects the human body and mind. Drawing from countless examples of torture and violence, she illustrates that pain quite literally destroys language and obliterates a person's consciousness. Scarry writes, physical pain destroys the mental content and language of the person in pain. And if you've ever been in extreme pain from a terrible migraine or breaking a bone or being violently assaulted, I'm sure you'd agree that in those moments, you don't feel liberated. You probably feel trapped. We often describe pain as blinding. It cuts off our sensory awareness. It causes you to retreat into yourself. But it's not a ticket to a magical inner fantasy land. It's like being sentenced to a dark void. Scarry goes on to talk specifically about torture's effect on the human mind, and the way torturers use pain as a tool, first to break down the victim's language, and then to speak through the victim. Think of a false confession, which is the torturer's words spoken through the mouth of the torture victim. We often see this described as breaking the victim, but it's also accurate to say that what's being broken is the victim's agency over their own language. Scarry writes that, as the victim's pain is transformed from their own personal experience into the words of the torturer, that pain becomes translated into an insignia for the regime. To put this into context of Sucker Punch, Baby Doll's fate, her expressionless face in the last shot, is an insignia of the mental institution. She's broken, unable even to speak her own words. Baby Doll is not liberated. This is the final form that they've reduced her to. They've turned her into a serene commercial for lobotomies, complete with a testimonial from Sweet Pea about how liberating the procedure was.
And who holds the key that can set us free? It's you.
But Sweet Pea's last line is a false confession, spoken for Baby Doll while Baby Doll is trapped, her very voice stolen from her. It's worth asking, who benefits from this type of narrative? Because it's not Baby Doll. In Sucker Punch, Baby Doll's lack of choice ties back to what I said earlier, about how I get the feeling that the pain and isolation in Snyder's work are exactly what attracts a particular type of very enthusiastic, very defensive fan to him. Not the people who are in the, we're just here because we love abs and punching camp. I see you, and I respect you. Snyder's films become a safe space where you can explore uncomfortable feelings, while outwardly maintaining your appearance as a hyper-masculine, no-homo dude bro. And let's also not ignore the fact that out of 6 films Snyder has directed for adult audiences, 4 either have explicit rape scenes or the strong suggestion of rape imagery. And he has not joked, about Batman getting raped. Pretty funny, Zack. Even in its 2 prominent films that don't have straight-up rape, Lois and Martha are repeatedly damsels in distress, which is just the PG-13 version of gendered violence. The way Snyder directs the rape scenes also tend to be more exploitative. For example, in the Watchmen comic, Silk Spectre's rape by the comedian was originally characterized as tragic and horrifying, but Snyder's voyeuristic take on it lingers on the female form in a very male-gazy way. Sexual violence always feels present, or at least bubbling under the surface in Snyder's films, in a way that always prioritizes spectacle and masculine dominance over the character's humanity. In my last video, I mentioned Bruce Wayne's final speech at the end of Batman v Superman, where he says,
"We fight, we kill, we betray one another, but we can rebuild.
I didn't bother including the final words of that quote, which are,
We can do better. We will. We have to."
And some people said that those final words disprove the argument that I was making, when really I just didn't include it because I didn't think it was saying anything worth mentioning. To me, this is not a hopeful, rousing speech because he's not actually saying, let's try something different, or maybe we can win without blowing up a city. After that entire movie, that line is so anticlimactic, I truly didn't think it was worth mentioning. Do what better, specifically? Do better how?
Be best.
About what? What? Okay. I just feel like if Batman's takeaway is do better, then that's not really much of a takeaway, let alone a resounding finale to Batman v Superman. First, just within the movie's narrative, what would doing better even mean? The movie starts out with Batman upset that Superman destroyed an entire city. And the film ends with Batman telling us that the only way to defeat the big monster is to retrieve the Krypton spear. So he says,
I gotta get it to chase me. Back to the city.
Back to the city. Of course, we do get a throwaway line about how the port is abandoned.
Why did you bring him back to the city?
The port is abandoned. There's a weapon here that can kill it.
Which looks like it was recorded after shooting since we conspicuously don't see Batman's face. As if an executive said, wait, why does he end up destroying half the city? So they added the line real quick. And are we expected to believe that had the spear been in a populated section of the city, Batman just wouldn't have retrieved it? That the fight would have just magically ended with no civilian casualties? It's a convenient deus ex machina to put the audience at ease with all the destruction, a mere 2.5 hours after we've been explicitly shown that if there's one thing this character believes, it's that destroying a city equals bad. Superman and Batman each begin their respective films lamenting the loss of human life, and each film ends with Superman or Batman embracing violence as the only solution. So better clearly doesn't mean find a way to win without causing mass destruction or mass civilian casualties, because the fact that the final battle happens in a supposedly abandoned part of the city was simply luck. It wasn't some valiant, humanistic choice by Batman. It really wasn't a choice at all, which ties in with how boring these movies are, but I digress. Also, he's saying this to Wonder Woman, the 5,000-year-old goddess who fought in World War I and watched her true love sacrifice himself for the betterment of mankind. He's lecturing this woman about how men are still good, which is the whole theme of her film, which Snyder was an executive producer on, and that script would have been pretty much locked at this point, so he would have known that that's what her arc would have been. In the wider Snyderverse, changing strategy or talking things out is never a viable option. Once again, we go back to the scene in Sucker Punch where Baby Doll and Sweet Pea are in a situation where we're told through blunt dialogue that it's impossible for the two of them to escape.
There's gotta be another way. No.
Snyderverse characters often make narrative proclamations like this that we're just supposed to take at face value and not think too hard about.
Port is abandoned.
Brute force is the only option on the table, and so it's the only option that they're willing to try. And then, magically, doing the biggest punch is what resolves the narratives. It's the screenwriting equivalent of, well, this one goes to 11. It's kind of ridiculous / funny when you go back and look at how many scenes begin with dialogue heading in an interesting direction and then get interrupted by something blowing up or someone throwing a punch or having one of the characters get up and walk away from a conversation to literally commit suicide. From the Persian ambassador who Leonidas just straight up murders mid-conversation, to Jor-El's pleading with the Supreme Council on Krypton being interrupted by Zod blowing stuff up, to Superman's appearance in Congress being interrupted by Lex Luthor blowing stuff up, to Baby Doll refusing to talk and instead leaving to go get herself killed despite Sweet Pea's pleading, to Pa Kent refusing to talk and instead leaving to go get himself killed despite Clark's pleading, to Superman leaving Lois to get himself killed despite her pleading. Many of these scenes would actually lead to really interesting character moments if they were allowed to continue as dialogue scenes, or really allowed to continue at all. Once is cool, twice is a pattern, 3 times is the Holy Trinity, but 20 times is like, okay, maybe you just don't know how to resolve a scene. As soon as the punches and explosions start, any dramatic questions raised by the dialogue is immediately forgotten, leading to audiences unconsciously feeling like something is missing, because we never get the payoff that Snyder sets up. I think that's also why a movie like Man of Steel can feel like the scenes are out of order, as Dan Olsen mentioned in his fantastic video on Man of Steel. Snyder keeps setting things up, but doesn't pay them off in any satisfying way. So when he jumps to another timeline or another plot thread, you lose any narrative momentum that he's managed to build up, and it can be really disorienting. This isn't to say that you should never interrupt dialogue with action. It's a time-honored action movie tradition. But when the action doesn't relate back to the themes raised by the dialogue, your movie kind of falls apart, or at least gets really confusing. The most comically over-the-top example of Snyder interrupting his own dialogue is 2 hours into Batman v Superman when Superman finally confronts Batman. In this moment, all Superman needs to say is, Lex Luthor is pitting us against each other. Literally any version of that thought. It can even come after the fight, but that's all that Superman needs to say to get them on the same side. Bruce already knows that Lex Luthor is evil. Bruce and Lex spent the entire movie giving each other the stink eye. However, over and over, instead of speaking just one brief sentence, Superman strolls around as they punch each other to death. And it's not like Superman isn't able to get out any complete sentences. In fact, the sentences that he does get out are very telling.
Stay down! If I wanted it, you'd be dead already.
Rather than communicating vital information to Batman, Superman is preoccupied with physically dominating him. The scene goes on for like 10 minutes. And of course, instead of the climax being, Lex Luthor is tricking you, which is the thing that we the audience have been primed for him to reveal to Bruce, it's, our moms have the same name. Martha. Because Snyder deals very much in large archetypal characters and casting, it's so easy to see just how gendered the actions in the Snyderverse are. The only characters interested in talking or being kind are feminine.
Come, Leonidas. Let us reason together.
This is how a democracy works. We talk to each other.
Punching is masculine. Dominance is masculine. When you juxtapose Xerxes' kindness to the savage cruelty Leonidas shows throughout the film,
the Spartans too are cruel to reject you, but I am kind.
The narrative seems to suggest that someone could only treat you with kindness as part of a ruse. So, of course, Superman couldn't just befriend Batman and tell him what was up. It's such a cynical view of masculine friendship. And dealing with archetypes and tropes is all well and good, but the film never looks at them in any sort of meaningful way. They're just the given. Stereotypes of emotionally stunted men and stereotypes of helplessly endangered women. And to be quite honest, we are so past these stereotypes that it feels archaic. And just to tie this all back to Batman saying that we need to do better, notice he's not saying, I, Batman, should have done a better job over the last 2.5 hours. There's no suggestion of introspection, just another very broad platitude about how people as a whole need to do better, while we see shots of civilians who had nothing to do with the events of the past 2 hours. And you know who else could have really done better? Superman. Maybe instead of nursing your playground grudge, you get straight to the point and use your words. It's tempting to argue that the Martha scene is just poorly written, but that's not quite accurate. Snyder is achieving a very important goal in writing the scene this way. By ending the Batman-Superman fight with Martha, the movie is distracting from the fact that Batman was fooled by Lex Luthor. It's like the film can't let its lead characters be fooled because that would make them weak. And there's no room for weakness in the Snyderverse. So you know what, Batman? Yeah, you should do better. Specifically, you. Do better. And Superman too. Leave Diana out of it. No, and you're like, Maggie, can you please stop talking? Well, I have just the treat for you. So we now go live to Eric Sophia from the channel Curio with some urgent breaking news.
Breaking news. This just in, Zack Snyder's films have been found to contain gender, and oh boy, do they contain some heckin' gender. The best places to start looking at how Snyder constructs gender are the places where the delicious, buttery argument of realism gets spread very, very thin. For that reason, we're going to look at one of Snyder's films where the societal norms and conventions portrayed in the film have nothing to do with the society the film is depicting. I know we're all thinking of the same movie here. Legend of the Guardians, The Owls of Ga'Hoole is a children's film adaptation of Catherine Lasky's book series of the same name, and oh boy is it weird seeing Zack Snyder do a heckin' gender to a bunch of owls. Oh, and he also did a film about some Greek guys, and we'll get to that too. So let's talk owls. I'm no ornithologist, but I do know that gender is a human social invention, so it never stops being weird how Zack's owl society perfectly recreates cis-heteropatriarchy. I'm, again, no ornithologist, but I can say that the cinematic language of the film makes it instantly obvious when the female love interest appears, and the way it does that is in the time-honored tradition of weakness and infantilization. Gilfie is small and physically weak and therefore needing of protection from Soren, and she's a dwarf owl, quite possibly to avoid the size comparison issue. It's not so much about individual odd things like this, it's about a pattern of decisions that recreate normative tropes around sex and gender. In the Owl movie, like an owl Miss Pac-Man, most of the female owls have more feminine facial designs, more feminine eyes, or even makeup incorporated into their character designs so that you can instantly clock them on sight. The female owls of the movie get far fewer lines, and until the midpoint, practically every female character is defined by their relationship to the protagonist. Soren's mum, Soren's sister, Soren's Ga'Hoole friend. Part of Snyder's most well-trodden trope, individualism versus the collective, involves the construction of a kind of enemy who strips away your personality and individuality by making you join them. In Owls of Ga'Hoole, the collective hypnotize some of their captive owls into working for them and train others to be iron-masked soldiers. Especially because all the gender presentation of these characters is in their faces, this means that the stripping away of individuality also amounts to a de-gendering. This is something Owls of Ga'Hoole has in common with 300. Much of the Persian horde that Leonidas and pals face down are faceless, masked figures or monsters. The implication, of course, is that if Sparta were to surrender, they would become faceless men or monsters too. Simply part of the horde. 300 shows us something about gender which carries on across much of Snyder's filmography, actually. The central cast are buff men with abs, with one or two women defined by their relationships to these men sprinkled in for humanizing good measure. But besides these sympathetic characters, every other person in the universe is a detestable other. The Persians are conspicuously queer-coded, Ephialtes is deformed, the Ephors are gnarled old men. Everyone who opposes the rugged individualism of Leonidas, one way or another, is an other. In this way, Snyder constructs not a gender binary, but a gender trinity. There are buff men with abs, there are the women who love them, and then there are others. This third category relates to something like what Frantz Fanon called the zone of non-being, a pointed lack of recognition as any viable or valid identity. They have identities, but none that the film considers acceptable. At this point, one has to ask, in these strictly gendered binary worlds that Zack Snyder creates, why does anyone even bother to resist the collective? They already have the most mayonnaise on white bread bland possible gender experience. What do they honestly even have to fight for? At least the Persians get to be fabulous. So we've talked about owls, we've talked about boys, so to cover all the genders, we should probably talk about Zack Snyder's film for the ladies. One of the hardest things to see from someone like this, who repeatedly reinforces the politics of the status quo and of oppression, is an earnest attempt to change things for the better. It's a little heartbreaking, honestly, to see Snyder in Sucker Punch trying so hard to construct an empowering feminist narrative. Sucker Punch is a very abstracted adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, which Lewis Carroll originally wrote to entertain his sick daughter. It's not much of a leap to see the pop feminist "liberate yourself, ladies" messaging as intended for Snyder's children, especially as he had 3 daughters at the time he made the film. Having read a few interviews with Snyder about Sucker Punch, it seems that his intention is a sort of proof of concept. Women can be traditionally feminine and also the stars of action movies. The obvious problem is that a female character from a male fantasy being the hero of a film doesn't automatically make it a female fantasy. However, giving Zack more credit here, since this is his passion project, I think it's fair to say that the brothel in the first level of fantasy is itself representative of male power fantasy stories, and the idea of the protagonists trying to escape it is clearly Snyder's intended message about women reclaiming their sexuality, gender expression, agency, and so on. Look, if Zack wants to really get into feminism, great, he should. Everyone should be a feminist. Go for it. But if he's not, then Hollywood should pay someone else who is a ton of money to make movies. But if Zack's gonna do it, then he has to buy into the central conceit that gender is fake, that it's socially constructed. We made it up to sell nylons. There's so much potential in the basic conceit of something like Sucker Punch, a feminist adaptation of Alice in Wonderland to explore the existential horror of the women experience being forced to exist in a fantasy that is not their own. In John Burge's Ways of Seeing, we get this incredible passage. Men act and women appear. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of woman in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus, she turns herself into an object, and most particularly an object of vision, a sight. In an interview about Sucker Punch, Snyder said, "Who dressed the women like that? It wasn't me, it was the audience. And fucking check it out, Ways of Seeing has something for that too. You painted a naked woman because you enjoyed looking at her. You put a mirror in her hand and you called the painting vanity, thus morally condemning the woman whose nakedness you had depicted for your own pleasure." Hollywood, please give someone who understands that gender is a crock of shit a ton of money to make movies instead. Or, Zack, if you're gonna do it, fine, but don't adapt The Fountainhead for the silver screen. Adapt Ways of Seeing instead. You can even buy my copy off me for $20 million.
Thanks, Eric. Always a pleasure. Be sure to go over to their channel, Curio, for lots of great videos, including their awesome new video about Ayn Rand's influence on Zack Snyder. It's objectively good. And now the section we've all been waiting for. We're going to dissect a Martha. There isn't much writing on how to make a Martha, so I had to do extensive research to really get to the heart of what and if is Aunt Martha. Of course, the titular Martha moment, for those of you who need a little refresher, is when Batman and Superman are fighting while Lex Luthor has Superman's mother, Martha, tied up in a stinky, gross room. Superman and Batman fight because that is why this movie was made. And when Batman finally gets the upper hand, holding a kryptonite spear to Superman's throat, Batman says,
"You are never even a man."
Finally, Superman mentions his mom by name.
You're kill Martha.
Batman then flashes back to his mother, also named Martha. And then, in case the person watching the movie fell asleep during the discussion of Martha and is now only waking up, Lois explicitly tells Batman that Martha is Superman's mom.
It's his mother's name!
After you watch the sequence in Batman v Superman, if you go back and watch the climax of Man of Steel, you realize that right before Superman kills Zod, basically the exact same thing happens. It's in the shot over shot where Superman sees this family, but more specifically, he sees the mom. Her face is the only face that's clearly framed in the shot. And then in the reverse, we see Superman reacting to her face. And then he snaps Zod's neck. But before this, throughout the whole fight with Zod, Superman refused to use the lethal force that Pa Kent explicitly told him is sometimes necessary. Seeing this woman and then imagining his mom's face in this random stranger's face is the thing that motivates Superman to finally kill the enemy. If only he had seen this woman's face sooner, all of Metropolis could have been saved. None of that death and destruction had an emotional effect on Clark, but after gazing at a woman who vaguely resembles his mom, he's a changed man. That scene doesn't really make sense. But it also makes absolute sense, because using white women as a rationalization for violence is as American as apple pie. So I think that we can safely state that one important role of a Martha is to trigger character development in men. This even happens in Sucker Punch to our main character when Hot Mangala gets a look from Baby Doll that teaches him that maybe women are also human right before he tears her brain apart with an ice pick. Notice how men always get to have these revelations, even in Snyder's supposedly female-driven story, but, I'm just glad that he gets to come to that realization so he can feel like a good person. But while some Marthas are just reminders of Martha, Batman's Martha isn't just any Martha. His Martha is his mom, Martha. Though, story-wise, she is just another Martha since we don't know any details about her, that Martha. We know nothing beyond that she is Batman's mother, Martha, so she's still, at the end of the day, a straw Martha. Superman having a human mother means that maybe he is kind of human-like to Batman, or maybe Superman has a shred of humanity that Batman can resonate with. But that makes the character Martha even less meaningful, because it's not that Batman himself feels empathy towards Superman's situation. It's that, maybe Superman isn't an outsider alien because he has a family similar to mine. It's less about Martha and more about Superman's place within a nuclear family, his identity within human society. Like how Jesus had a human mother, so he was definitely human. It makes him like 100% human and 100% divine, 200% person. Also, this is just funny. The name Martha means lady. Just a lady.
Okay.
It could be any lady, any Martha. Oh, and Saint Martha is the patron saint of housewives, so... lady. But so far, I've only answered how is a Martha. Let's continue on to what is a Martha. According to Pa Kent and Clark Kent, a Martha is a man's world. Ghost Dad Pa Kent mentions this when Clark visits him on the snowy mountain, in response to Clark slipping in a horribly disturbing question.
Did the nightmares ever stop? Yeah. When I met your mother.
This little interchange is so loaded, it's wild. If you read these Superman movies as a metaphor for any kind of trauma or psychological turmoil, like, say, being bullied by other boys, or being a victim of abuse, or being conflicted about your sexuality in a deeply conservative state like Kansas, no matter what the problem is, Pa Kent suggests that the nightmares will go away if you just find the right girl and settle down. Which feels a little self-contradictory when you remember that Pa Kent literally killed himself in front of his own wife, just destroying the rest of her life. Or later, after Superman tells Lois,
"You are my world."
And then Superman kills himself in front of Lois as she begs him not to.
No. Please. Go.
Apparently, she is his world, expected to cure all of his problems and emotional baggage. But the moment he gets a chance to charge headlong into death, all she can do is plead for him not to leave. These men treat their Marthas less like equal partners and more like a false promise by an authority figure that obtaining a girlfriend is a primary objective, which is incredibly unhelpful and, repeat after me, that's how we get incels. Clark only ever really opens up emotionally around Lois or Martha. But of course, it's never an equal back and forth. It's usually just to do what his father suggested, using them to explore his feelings while never asking them about theirs. Throughout the Snyderverse, wives and female partners act as a location where men can go to feel emotion, or at least be in the proximity of emotion without ever being expected to express it themselves.
Goodbye, my love. He doesn't say it. There's no room for softness. Not in Sparta. No place for weakness.
Just as men in the Snyderverse are expected to look and act a certain way, women are expected to look and act a certain way too. The expectations for women are just way more limited. Acting as a cheerleader.
I just think he's kind of hot.
Or a trophy to get the boys riled up to go off to battle. And when they're not on camera, they might as well not exist. The silliest example of this, as I mentioned before, is when Batman and Superman are fighting. Supposedly, Superman is there to figure out how to save his mom, but I guarantee nobody in the audience is feeling worried about Martha. Halfway through the fight, we've all forgotten about her, because we're here to watch our two favorite superheroes punch each other to death. You know, guy shit. Throughout this entire scene, Superman never acts as though one of the most important women in his life is in mortal danger. There is zero dramatic tension around the question of, will Martha be saved? No sense of urgency until the end when it's like, oh wait, what was this fight about? And then suddenly it's Martha this and Martha that.
Martha, Martha, Martha!
So a Martha is a trophy to win, an object to catch, and she's your wife, and she's your mom, but she's also a mom to your kids, and also she is your world, but also screw her opinions, and I'm gonna jump headlong into death. She is many, many, many things. And she is also absolutely nothing, because when the camera isn't on her, she ceases to exist. Her inner emotional life doesn't matter, if she even has one. And her backstory doesn't matter, because she definitely doesn't have one. Any scene that starts with her, we're really just waiting around for a superhero to show up and do something manly. And you don't even have to tell her that you love her, because, Sparta. The only possible exception to how Snyder tends to write female characters is Anna. Although many other people had a hand in writing and shaping her character, and he hasn't even come close to creating a character like her since, so it's not every day you see a director get worse at depicting women. Don't worry, that whole Martha section only cost me $3 million to film. I had to edit out my mustache. The Snyderverse is a very, very traditionally masculine place. Of course, in reality, what constitutes masculine or feminine are in constant flux because they are social constructs. The Snyderverse, however, is constructed in a way that the film canon explores almost exclusively, quote-unquote, traditionally masculine traits. Being a lone wolf, physical power being paramount, stoicism being prized over outward displays of emotion, the list goes on. And I think that is a huge draw for the movies. I mean, they were for me. When we think of Zack Snyder, especially pre-Watchmen days, we went to his movies for meaty men kicking people down wells and throwing babies over the side of a cliff. And it made sense for the time. These were the days when the edgy humor of South Park was all the rage. And that tone has remained consistent in his work. I mean, that's why he was picked for these projects. They didn't pick Snyder for Superman thinking he'd make a feel-good, inspiring movie. His portrayal of masculine tropes is comically on the nose and hyperbolic. And if he had an ounce of camp or self-reflection about that, then I think we might see some interesting nuance and growth over the years. Maybe he'd have something to say about two men who are literally unable to speak a simple phrase like, hey, the bad guy's tricking you. Instead, he has to make them go through this bizarre mental and emotional gymnastics of saving a Martha. Two men who are unable to communicate their pain. And I do just want to point out that Snyder is by no means alone here. I mean, look at the way Marvel handled Gamora and Black Widow. Sure, they're far more developed characters than a Martha, but Black Widow thinking that she's a monster because she can't have kids is offensive and archaic and completely took a lot of people out of the movie. Which was written, of course, by Joss Whedon, who all of us know is problematic. And by the time he was brought in to replace Snyder on Justice League, we all knew that he was problematic, so it does beg the question, why would Warner Brothers feel like he was a suitable replacement? Snyder's films don't really engage with the idea of hypermasculinity. Instead, it's just presented as a given, as if it's just how things are. So it doesn't super surprise me that the people who say things like, "this is how the real world is," tend to be men, who also tend to use misogynist insults towards women a lot, who tend to act as gatekeepers for fandom. And why, when film critics criticize Snyder's films, people take it personally instead of just what it is, a criticism of art. But they take it personally because it's an attack on their made-up idea of masculinity that is beneficial for them to defend as real. If this is how you feel like you need to define yourself, then none of your emotional problems will go away. And no Martha will ever be enough to make you happy because Marthas are a myth.
Yeah, but she's my myth.
No, myth.
Yes?
And circling back to that tweet from Dad, this tweet basically sums up the problems that toxic masculinity perpetuates. Toxic masculinity, by the way, refers to the very specific definition of an adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotions that boys and men may comfortably express, while elevating other emotions such as anger, or in Batman's case, rage. Snyder truly is the king of depicting men who are angry and alone, but he wants to have it both ways, positioning these men as leaders of the society they're in, but who also want to stand up to the corruption within that society that they lead. So their pain ends up being performative rather than cathartic, an ego-driven exercise in self-pity rather than selfless heroism. It's like if a powerful businessman complained about how unfair everyone was to him, how he's this huge victim of society, while tweeting those complaints from the Oval Office. At the end of the day, rather than making the world better, the leaders often just make it objectively worse, by design. Like instead of fixing anything, they just say, do better.
Be best.
We see this effect in almost all of Snyder's films, especially with the stilted dialogue.
Hi.
Hi.
Coding femininity as perverse and backing characters into a corner of limited emotional space. They are alone or they're angry, with no visible path toward happiness or joy. And you know what? I think that's pretty real. So in a way, you're right. These movies are real. Another way to think of a lone wolf is a person who has trouble making lasting connections with others. A broken child can grow up to become an adult who refuses to confront their childhood trauma. I mean, we know this Batman and Rorschach are not in therapy. It's the flip side of the coin of backing ourselves into a stunted emotional corner, which, again, I think is what a lot of people recognize as true in Snyder's work. But instead of an examination, it's just a fish in a fishbowl, continuously circling without realizing it's in water. As a woman who is feminine, who is queer, I can't live in a world like that. I can't watch Wonder Woman be one thing to Patty Jenkins and then be a completely different character in the rest of the DC universe to appease a narrow, male-dominated audience.
She with you?
I thought she was with you.
She's with no one, boys. The Wonder Woman of Patty Jenkins and the Wonder Woman of the Snyderverse are two completely different Wonder Women. One is confident and independent and has hope for mankind. The other gets lectured about mankind by a spoiled, stubborn billionaire. I don't belong here. I'm hit by falling concrete during the destruction of Metropolis. And because Snyder never really changes or evolves as a filmmaker, I can't personally get excited about anything he does because he's also backed himself into an emotional corner. One that makes the Snyderverse feel very, very small.
The world's too big, Mom.
So small that his Rorschach and Batman are indistinguishable, even though one is supposed to be a comment on the other. The superheroes in Snyder's world feel woefully unresponsive to any of the actual issues in American culture at the moment. And instead of an exploration, all we have is a replication of a few narrow ideas, circling around over and over in Snyder's work. Ideas that he often bulldozes over the source material to inject into his stories. Which brings me to my very scientifically sound conclusion. After months of drowning in the Snyderverse, I've become somewhat of an expert. I've met many a Martha, talked to every real-life billionaire superhero I could find. Couldn't find any. But what I've come to know to be true is, If you want to compare the Snyderverse to any other cinematic filmoverses, the most accurate comparison is the Twilight saga.
I have considered radioactive spiders and kryptonite.
It's all superhero stuff, right? What if I'm not the hero? What if I'm the bad guy?
You're not.
And I'm not just saying that because it's hilarious, which it is. Twilight is a fantasy series that was written for very insecure women who are insecure in their womanhood. And the Snyderverse is written for very insecure men who are insecure in their manhood. I mean, that's why Twilight exploded. It's pure fantasy about one girl who's different from all the other girls, who is not one, but two mystical men fighting over her. It's honest to God brilliant. Because if society teaches teenage girls to be anything, it's insecure. And that's a huge parallel to the Snyderverse. Team Jacob or Team Edward? Hashtag who will win. It's a place where men can live out their fantasy with a symbol from their literal childhood who epitomizes their particular definition of masculinity. The Snyderverse feels like a direct response to the complexity of modern society, and it's absolutely terrified of that complexity. We're getting to the point where superhero movies have saturated the market for decades. But the Snyderverse has, for the most part, remained unmistakably the Snyderverse, in a way that doesn't seem like it's at pace with being the 1,000th time we've seen Batman's parents get killed. His attachment to the past is one reason that Snyder's work retains the audience that it does, but it's also led to the dulling of Snyder's reputation from a dynamic, VFX-driven action director to a gloomy filmmaker who can't tell a competent story. To bring it back to my first video, superheroes do the right thing, even when it's hard. And if we've learned anything in the past 4 years, it's that rage is easy. Compassion is hard. I get the feeling that many of the most frustrated, angry Snyder fans really do feel great pain in their lives, physically or emotionally. So much pain that maybe they've lost the capacity to speak or to articulate that pain. And the thing that makes me sad about these films is that it seems to say that the only solution is to simply shut down or be filled with rage. Or worse, worship that very pain rather than seeking out a solution or finding your own voice. Snyder's vision of the world is unmistakably corporate, even though it tries to convey itself as just being good old-fashioned small-town Americana. It treats women as less than while going through the motions of worshiping women. It's unmistakably miserable, cynical, and grim, despite all the vague sentiments about glory and honor and nobility and being good and doing better. It's filled with men who we're supposed to look up to, even though they seem lost and incapable of doing anything virtuous, aside from being able to punch harder than anyone else can punch. It's a world where the best thing about living seems to be dying. It's a world in complete denial. And it's a world that Snyder has created to show us, not what the world is really like, but how some people want the world to be. He's amassed a very loyal, very vocal, unrepresentative following that also wants his movies to be true, who loudly proclaim that his cartoonish fantasy worlds are in fact reality and not just a bizarro Twilight. And that desire to live in a fictional universe where your fists are all you need to solve your problems and treating people like garbage makes you a hero might actually be the strongest commentary anyone could ever make on toxic masculinity. So anyway, stream Birds of Prey! If you've made it this far, comment below with what you'd be doing off screen when Snyder cuts away from you. I think I'd probably be floating in a black void, or in a bathtub. While the characters in the Snyderverse have a hard time communicating, you know who doesn't? All the wonderful creators over on the streaming service Nebula. All my videos are on Nebula, plus tons of exclusive ad-free content from all your favorite creators, like Lindsay Ellis's uncensored version of her Omegaverse video, featuring my voice as a very girl boss lawyer. It also has original podcasts like Polyphonic and 12 Tones Ghost Notes, in which these two lovely men gab about music until you're all but reaching for whatever great album they've just been listening to. And if you sign up for Nebula, you might just get some very cool exclusive content from me in the near future. And if that wasn't reason enough already, Nebula has partnered with CuriosityStream, the streaming service that has thousands of documentaries. If you sign up for a CuriosityStream with my link below, you'll get a free subscription to Nebula. That's 2 streaming services for the price of 1 and endless hours of content from the best of the best. It's almost the end of the year, and I know you didn't make it through all those books you promised to read, so why not sign up for a Curiosity Stream and just ingest it through your eyeballs instead? Thank you so much for watching, and an extra special thank you to all my patrons who make these videos possible. If you'd like to help support the channel, head over to patreon.com/Maggie Mae Fish, where you can get early access to my videos, plus your names in the credits among these fine folks. And thank you to Adam Ganzer, who lent me their vocal cords. You can check out our podcast, I'll Show You Mine If You Show Me Yours, on the Small Beans Network, wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks again to Eric Sophia. You can find a link to their channel below. And together, we can create a world where Marthas don't need saving.